There are not a lot of ERP systems out there that are going to allow you to do what Sage Office Connector does. Other ERP systems will lock down their systems because they want you to use their data entry screens. However, with Sage 300 Construction and Real Estate in tandem with Sage Office Connector, we are going to free that to allow you to manage your data in many different ways, specifically from Excel, as we'll show in here today. Currently, Sage Office Connector does have over 3,000 CRE customers that are currently adopting the Sage Office Connector product with over 10,000 concurrent uses out there in the market. And so from these numbers, you can tell that this is a solution that your peers have adopted, and this is a proven technology. And if you're familiar with Microsoft Excel, then you're going to pick this tool up really quickly, and you'll be able to enhance your data management and reporting capabilities instantly. And you'll see in today's demonstration how we can accomplish that. But this next slide here will provide some context as to how Sage Office Connector works. We have Sage 300 CRE here on the bottom of this slide, and you'll see at the top we have an Excel workbook. Now, Sage Office Connector has many different pieces, and with Sage Office Connector, we can not only query the data into Microsoft Excel, but we can also use Excel as a data entry screen. We have the ability to write information directly into Sage tables using Sage Office Connector. Sage Office Connector can also be used to create import files that can be automatically fed into Sage from the Office Connector tool. We do also have a financials piece that is an extension of the query module to allow us to run financials. We do host a variety of complimentary webcasts on each of these topics, and I do have a pre-recorded session on each of them. Today we will be focusing on the write capabilities of Sage Office Connector, but if you're interested in any of the other capabilities, put that request into the question section, and I'll be sure to follow up with you after the call here today. But before we jump into the write capabilities, I do want to do a quick refresh for you guys on the Sage Office Connector query. Now, when we query data into Microsoft Excel, some of you may be thinking of pushing information from an inquiry, or this would be static data into a worksheet. However, this is not what we're talking about when we talk about querying information into Excel. What we're talking about here is much more advanced. Now, the disadvantage with the last example is that all of your information is going to be static, which means that if we ever wanted to refresh the data, we need to start over by going back into that inquiry that we showed. But with the advantage of Sage Office Connector, we are going to make Excel a Sage technology, as we're going to be connecting to our live Sage database. And so what that means is that you essentially create a customized report once and then refresh that data as needed. And this is what really sets Office Connector apart from other systems out there that are pushing static data into Microsoft Excel. And so now that we have a base understanding of how the Office Connector query program works, we're going to be highlighting how that works really well in tandem today with the Office Connector write. And today we are focused on data entry from Sage. And if you're thinking about data entry with any ERP system, this can be a tedious process. And when you were initially trained on Sage 300 CRE, your consultant probably taught you how to input data into the Sage data entry screens, like you see on the left-hand side of the slide here. And this is how the program was designed many years ago, and how the programs envisioned the end users would be utilizing the program. However, when we start talking about large data sets, using these data entry screens can become a daunting task. And to manage these larger data sets, we can use import functions within Sage, and we can also write values directly to the database. Most of the issues around importing stem around formatting the CSV file properly. And if you joined us in our Office Connector import demonstration last week, then you saw how Office Connector can create those import files for us. Now, when we talk about writing to the database, we're talking about leveraging the ODBC drivers, or Open Database Connectivity. And the second two options are where Office Connector is going to come in to help. And today we will be demonstrating how we can write values directly into Sage tables from Microsoft Excel. Now, it is important to distinguish the differences between importing and writing when using this tool. Writing will allow you to replace information in Sage. Think about managing your data. Whereas importing values into Sage will create new values or new transactions, effectively creating new records. As a general rule, what you can write, you cannot import, and what you can import, you cannot write. However, there are a few exceptions to this rule. Now, when we look at the differences between writing and importing, importing is a way to indirectly get the data into Sage through using one of the Sage import programs. If we use the example of an invoice will need to be imported into Sage 300 CRE, as there are transactional items that are created when we use an invoice. However, if we just want to change the approval status on that invoice, we can write that directly to the invoice record. And so that's one example of where we have one item that you want to approach it differently depending on what you're trying to do. And so if you would like more information on the differences between writing and importing, we'd be happy to set up a direct demonstration for you and your company to kind of go over the differences in a bit more detail. We do also have resources online through the knowledge base, which will talk about, based on what you're trying to do, should I be writing or importing values into Sage? And so it is important to understand the difference here between importing a CSV file and then using ODBC drivers to write values directly to the database. Now, before we jump into the software here today, James, did you want to chime in and add anything to what we've stated so far, specifically around the difference between write and import, or anything else we've covered?
No, I think you've done a really great job. It's just that a lot of times when we've interacted with folks, the expectation is that there's just one means to get data in. So people try interchangeably use these words, but as we're demonstrating here, they're very different. And so we want to, the more precise we're able to be, the better we can guide people to using the correct technology. So other than that, excellent.
Sounds good. And thank you for that insight there, James. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump on into the software here today. And the first thing that I want to highlight for everybody is the Office Connector Launchpad. And so when you install Sage Office Connector, I'm going to close this real quick. You're going to get a little icon here on your desktop that'll say Office Connector Launchpad. And this is where we can really get started using the program. The first thing I'll highlight is the Welcome tab here, and this gives you lots of details on things that are upcoming for Office Connector, or product information, updates, as well as accessing the knowledge base that I referenced a moment ago. But today we will be focusing on the writing capabilities, and if you come under the Reports tab, when you license the write capabilities, you'll see some of those reports down here below. And these down here are templates. And what I mean by templates is that you can start using these today with your Sage data. However, you may want to modify them a bit to make them truly useful for you and your company. And we will be covering a couple of these topics here in just a few minutes. However, I do want to start by opening up a blank workbook in Microsoft Excel, and I'm going to show how we can begin to write values into Sage 300 Construction and Real Estate using Microsoft Excel. Now, the example that I'm going to use today will be updating a vendor record. And so if you are familiar with the Accounts Payable module, you know that we can come in here and we can set up vendors within 300 Construction and Real Estate. And when you set up a particular vendor within Sage, there's lots of different details that we're going to be pulling up here. And so I'll go ahead and click Next to get to that next vendor record. And you'll notice that if you did task someone with managing the data within Accounts Payable, they could come in here and consume a license of Accounts Payable and just look at all of the different things that they could come in here and change. They could change the telephone number, the address, the contact details. They could come over and even change 1099 settings. Do they receive 1099s, or what are those tax ID numbers? And these could be modified. And so one advantage of using Excel as a data entry form is that you get to decide what that user gets to see, and we can do all of that without consuming a license of accounts payable. Now, I do want to highlight here that this is A1 Electric Company, and I'm going to be modifying the name here. As we can write to many different fields within the vendor record, this is just one of them, the name. We could also, change the telephone number and lots of other details on the vendor record directly from Microsoft Excel. So I'm going to show how we can do that here today. So we'll go ahead and close this window down, and we're going to jump back into Microsoft Excel. Now, if you're not familiar with Sage Office Connector, it will live in the Add-ins tab of your Microsoft Excel solution. And these are all of the different functions that are available for Sage Office Connector right here. Now, I want to show how the write capabilities are going to work in tandem with the Office Connector query. And so the first thing that I want to do is run a query against that vendor table that's in Accounts Payable. And we can do that using the Office Connector Query Wizard. When you select the Query Wizard, the first thing you're going to do is log into a data folder. And I've already logged in, otherwise it would enforce that Sage security right here. But we're going to select the appropriate data folder that we're working with. You may have one or you may have multiple there. And when we do so, we're met with a list of all of the tables that are within our 300 construction and real estate system. Now, with any report writer, you will need to be familiar with the database. And so familiarizing yourself with where information is located on these tables will be part of the learning curve when adopting the Sage Office Connector product. But if you're familiar with other report writers, you'll need to be familiar with this regardless. But the benefit of Office Connector is that we can preview these tables here. And so if I'm not sure if the information is on the table I want, I could preview that. And so here I pulled up the invoice table, and this is not the table I want to update if I want to update the vendor. Perhaps you want to come into the AP vendor table down here below. When we select this table and click Next, I'm then going to be met with all of the different records against that table. And so these are the fields that perhaps I could write to and change some of the details here, such as contact details or the customer number and other items within here. But for today's example, I'm going to grab the vendor number, the vendor name, and I'll grab the address information as well as the zip code there and the telephone. We'll go ahead and click Next. And this is asking me if I'd like to condition the query that I'm pulling into Microsoft Excel. In the query demonstrations that we provide, we do explain why you would want to condition this. And if I click Next, it's going to assume that I want every single vendor on that table, which is totally fine for today's example. So I'll go ahead and click Next. The next section here that I do want to highlight are the data options. This section here that's checked off, insert the table that can be refreshed with live data. This is really where the Office Connector shines and the ability to refresh that data automatically. However, for today's example, I'm going to pull that in as static because I'm going to be modifying records. And so I don't want to pull in new data. I want to have the old record and the new record. And you'll see why in just a few minutes. However, being able to refresh this as live data is huge. And for any of these, we will name those queries for you. And it is best practice to name this as something that you will remember it because we can reference it here in the menu options as well. So when I click Finish, it's going to go ahead and pull in all of my vendors from the AP vendor table, and I can begin to update this list here accordingly, or I can begin to work with it. The beauty in working in Microsoft Excel is that we can use formatting options. So, perhaps I want to highlight this up here and change this header here to green. I'm empowered to do that. We could bold it and, do other items and whatnot. And to highlight the Office Connector write capabilities today, the example I'm going to go through is going to be updating a vendor record name. And so what I'm going to type in here is going to be new name. And you may also decide to, change this if you were going to hand this off to someone else to do. You may want to, create an entry grid like you see here and, put some borders in there to make it look like, okay, this is where we're going to enter in some new names. You could also decide to protect this sheet and lock everything else down so the only cells they can enter are in the new name here. Now, I already showed you inside of 300 CRE how my name for A1 Electric Company is as such, and you'll see it pulls in automatically. But we'll say that, instead of or instead of A1 Electric Company, let's say that they changed their name to, A1 Electric Company LTD. So they added the LTD, or perhaps I'll use LLC for today's example. Let's say that they modified their name, and we need to update that accordingly. Well, in order to write this value into Sage is actually very simple. I would recommend coming off to the right here, and I'm going to put this in column M5 here, or cell M5. And when you're ready to start triggering the write, you'll come up into the Add-ins tab and use the Write Wizard. When I select Write Wizard, the first thing that it's asking me is select the table that we're interested in. Well, I want to update the AP vendor table within my Sage accounting system. So I'll select AP vendor and then select Next. It's asking if I'd like to modify, create or modify, and I'm going to select modify today. And if you're curious on the differences here, we can set up a direct demo to go over that in more detail. What it's selecting now is to select the key field that's used in locating the desired record. Well, I'm updating the vendor, and I know that the key field for the vendor is the vendor number. And my vendor number for A1 Electric Company is in column C5. So I'm going to put $C5. And the $sign there is an anchor field, and that's just leveraging the power of Excel. And so I will be copying this formula down. And so when I select Next here, it's saying, okay, what are we going to replace here? So these are the fields here that we can replace within the vendor table. So I could write to all of these different fields and update them accordingly. So perhaps you want to write workers' comp insurance proof requirement. We can write those type values into the Sage tables, no problem. But I'm going to stay simple today, and we're just going to update the name, and I'll go ahead and click Next. And then it says, okay, what's the value that you'd like to write? Well, I want to write whatever's in the new name column, so that's going to be E5. So I'll put that in as $E5. We'll go ahead and click Finish, and that created a formula here. And this formula that you see on the right-hand side is what's going to do the heavy lifting in getting these values into Sage. Now, keep in mind, we only need to set up this grid once, and then we could repeat the use of this document, multiple times. However, I'll just be doing it here for the new name today, but you watched me create this in just a couple minutes. And so if everything went correctly, what I can do here is select Write Values into Sage, or Send Data to Sage 300 CRE. And when I click that, it's first going to say, okay, you need to approve these changes. We're going to modify vendor 100, we're going to modify the name, and here's the new value that we're going to put in there, A1 Electric LLC. So I'm going to go ahead and write that value into Sage, and it'll give you an audit letting you know whether or not it was successful. And looks like it was successful here based on this. And notice how this file here is saving to my C drive, or looks like, it's saving to my computer here. So this audit here will save automatically to your computer, so you have a record of every time that you've written to the database. So just to kind of prove that there's no smoke and mirrors here, what I'm going to do is jump back into my accounts payable, and I'm going to open up that setup vendors once again. And so if it truly was successful, then when I pull up that vendor, the name should be A1 Electric Company LLC. And you'll see here that I did effectively update that record here within Sage. So just highlighting the Office Connector writing capabilities and how we can write values into Sage without using a license of accounts payable and without providing access to all of these different fields to someone that may be doing that data entry for us. And so with that, I'll go ahead and close this out, but I want to show how we can do more. And so if we came here into the data entry field, I want to show a strategy in how we can do a selective undo. And so what we're going to do here is type in undo ? And then this is going to say, okay, I don't want to do this. I want to actually switch it back to A1 Electric Company. And to do this, I'm simply going to leverage what's available here in Microsoft Excel. And so I'm going to use a U here for today's example. However, you could make this a checkbox or a radio button or something like that to indicate, like, you know what, we need to undo that change. And so all it's going to require is a slight edit of that TS right formula that's in that column in here over on the right-hand side. And so you will be able to get familiar with this tool here in editing these formulas up above. And once you get to that point, you're really going to be able to extend the power of Sage Office Connector Write. And so currently you can see here that for vendor 100 here, it's going to write that value here that's blue. But what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to add an if statement. And what I'm going to say is if the value that is in G4 here, or not F4, is a U, then I don't want to write what the new name is. I want to write the old name. Otherwise, do use whatever is there inside of the column E5. Okay. So now that I've created that formula there, oh, I've entered too many arguments there. Let's see, what did I do?
You have a comma after the
Oh,
F.
that's what it is. There it is. That should be good, right?
No, that comma, sorry, the syntax can be squirrely. That comma stays. When you have if F5, if F5 comma this, otherwise, equals. You have a comma instead of if F5 equals right there. See, right after the F5 there, that comma. Get rid of that and put an equal sign. So if 5 equals U, then do this, otherwise do this.
Oh, you know what? I wrote down the formula before the demo today, and I totally have the equal sign there.
But no, the point is great because that's an Excel function. And the first person I ever saw do that was just an end user. And I asked, like I was flabbergasted that they were able to come up with this. And I said, well, how did you know? And they said, well, it's just Excel. So someone's knowledge of Excel would allow them to be successful and innovate that. So,
yeah.
Very good.
And yeah, great point there. And so what I've effectively done here is just put an if statement into this formula that says, if there's a U here in column F, undo what I did and use the old name here. And so to highlight that, what I'll do is go ahead and send the values into Sage now. And when I do that, you'll see, okay, we're updating vendor 100, but instead of adding the LLC at the end, we're going to change it back. And so I can go ahead and write that value into Sage, and it's effectively going to undo the changes that I made. So what I showed here today is a strategy to selectively undo writing that we've done to the Sage database. And that's the primary reason I pulled the information in as static today, whereas I could have pulled it in as live.
And Marshall, if you'll indulge me, I've been affiliated with this technology for 35 years. So in the course of consulting, that sort of thing has come up. People have maintained data and maybe a lot of data, and then when they realize things are not correct, they didn't do it the way they wanted, they would ask me, well, how will I get the data back? Well, the only way would be to restore from backup, everything from backup. There would be no selectively restoring one thing or another, because you'd have to restore the entire table, right? Not just the fields on it. This is the only way to be able to selectively restore from a restore point. So it's simple. It's all Excel based. But the other aspect of what you're demonstrating is we've had people who periodically have taken, in fact, I was talking to a security person recently in the airport where they were coming back from someone whose system was compromised with hostageware. And it reminded me of another Sage customer who periodically replicated their data, text like you did, static in Excel. They were able to restore their data set by using Office Center, write it, and import to recreate detail that was otherwise lost. They didn't have it; it was gone. They had no backup. All their backups were compromised, but the CSV files and stuff, they weren't compromised. So you just demonstrated something that other ERP systems don't offer that could be extraordinarily useful. And people sometimes they'll see something but not fully appreciate the context of how powerful it is. So I'm hoping everybody does realize that. Excellent job,
Yeah.
Marshall.
Yeah, of course. And so basically my goal there was to highlight the right designer and how we can design the ability to write values into Sage very easily in tandem with Office Connector Query. And so what I'd like to do with the remainder of the time that we have together today is highlight a couple of the templates that do come with the solution here. And I've already preloaded a couple of these. And the first one we're going to talk about is how we can write payroll employee information into Sage. And so this is one that comes out of the box here. And if you're not familiar with the templates that come with Sage Office Connector, they will all have an information tab that explains the purpose of this particular workbook, what the required software is, as well as a disclaimer saying that, yes, we are live connecting to your database and we will be updating records. And that's kind of the point. And so here, if we come under the employee information, we're first going to enter in an employee ID. And so I'll type that in as 117. And oops, I put that in the wrong place. We'll put it right here, and I'm going to type 117. And when we click out of that, you'll notice that it pulls data here that's currently within Sage. So it's pulling the information regarding Marshall, that I'm a sales engineer, and address information and whatnot. I don't actually live on 920 Sunshine Court, but I could update this with my actual information. So similar to the data grid that I created before, you could task someone else to come in and enter details for all of these different records and then hand it back to you. Once we update the information here, whether we need to update the name or the middle name or something like that, we can click one button to write that information directly into the database. So just showing how we can update payroll employee information right from here. Now, if we did enter in a number, say like 9999, you'll see how it's a new employee here, and so we could actually create a new employee as well. And so this is just one example of a write template that is available for you when you start using the program. Another template that I wanted to highlight here today is going to be the AP Invoice Approval. And so I mentioned earlier that we need to import invoices into the system if we're creating the new records. But you guys probably have an approval process set up for your invoices, and as you're aware, you can manage that within 300 CRE. And so we actually have another template that's designed to write AP invoice approvals directly into Sage 300 CRE. We can come here to see those invoices that are currently unapproved within Sage, and we can then say, is this approved? And we just need to enter a non-blank value, so we could put in like an A for approved. And then when we write values into Sage, we're basically updating the approval directly from Microsoft Excel. So allowing you a platform that you can work in that you're familiar with in Excel and being able to update records that are within Sage without having to navigate all of the windows within the program. James, was there anything that you wanted to add, with regards to this template or any of the others that are available?
Well, this will clearly work, right? It's an example where you can circulate via Excel and then have that data update Sage. But another way to look at any of these templates is how else might they be utilized? So, and I don't know if you're going to cover it, but if you don't mind, I'll just say what I've seen people do. I've seen other people take something like this and say, we may or may not use it for this approval because they may have something else for that, but circulating invoices of whether maybe we should pay them or not, right? So operations, people can chime in. Yes, maybe I have 2 or 3 people that chime in on when something should be paid that I could then consider for cash flow or what have you. You could do that here in Excel, and that could be put back into Sage, like, for example, on a distribution. There's a distribution code, so if your settings allow you to have a distribution code, and you could add that if you don't have it already, then we can write a distribution code, and I've seen people use check runs, like check run 100, 101, 102. So they're writing them into the distribution codes. Well, now that's available when you go to select invoices for payment. You can say pay all the invoices for check run 100, 101, 102. So you've streamlined, right, how you are using Sage to become more effective. and it's not very difficult to do at all. So that's an example. We could apply in other ways.
Yeah, great point there. And so what we're essentially doing with this here is just pulling in those unapproved invoices. If there is an approval box on the invoice and it is not checked, return these invoices. So I did receive a question in the chat regarding a TimberScan user. And so you may be using Sage Paperless or TimberScan. And they asked, if we're using TimberScan for approvals, would this worksheet replace that or be in conjunction with it? Well, the way that I understand those couple systems to work is that they are importing the invoices into Sage, similar to how you could import, straight from Excel. And so when it imports those into Sage, I would need to verify, and I would need to do some testing to give you an exact answer. I would need to test as to whether or not, when that invoice comes into Sage from TimberScan or Paperless, if it's checking that box for the approval. If it is not, then I would see that as a gap with those other solutions. But if it is, then you could use this in conjunction with that for any invoices that did not go through TimberScan or Sage Paperless. And keep in mind, TimberScan is not a Sage product, so just be aware of that. And but at any rate, you could use this in conjunction with those tools to facilitate that. Anything you'd like to add to that, James?
Yeah, and to just also, this is an example. It could be used for this purpose, but as I said, it could be used for other purposes that you might see a benefit. And that's where I said that this template could be modified so that a different one could handle whether invoices were selected for payment or not. So from one example, you could create any number of useful additional, automation steps. So if you want to know more or maybe see how to go about changing it to accommodate, selecting invoices for payment or whatever, then we could do a presentation. Later we'll prompt you for your feedback, and if you'd like to see us do something like that, we could do that in one of these presentations.
Yeah, and I received a follow-up question on that. Can we use this function to change invoice payment type to EFT? What I did is I navigated to where you would write values into an AP invoice, and I'm not sure if that's something specifically, changing the type to EFT.
But the question is very good, because as people begin to understand, that's the right way to think. Could I use it for this? Could I use it for that? That's when opportunities start to come up. So what Marshall's showing you is he went in using the right wizard, to look at what is replaceable on that table, and he's showing you a list of what he sees. So what is communicating to this to write if a field is replaceable or not? What is causing that? That's a dictionary file in Sage. Sage comes with dictionaries. Now there is the opportunity to get a custom dictionary in certain areas where more data could be replaced, but by default only certain information. So on that table, certain fields are replaceable, but a different table, a lot more fields are replaceable. So it just depends on what you want to do. But it starts with thinking, I want to improve a process. That's when you can the magic begins right there.
Yeah, great point there, James. And so with that is just about everything that we had prepared to show you all here today within the software. However, I do have a couple of slides here with some additional resources that are available. So we'll go ahead and jump back into those now. And so the first thing I'll show is just another layout of the Office Connector product suite. Today, we first did a kind of overview of the query aspects of Sage Office Connector, and I highlighted how we can design a query, and I pulled the vendor information into Microsoft Excel. We then highlighted the Write Designer capabilities, showing how we can design our own entry fields, and then click a button and have those new values go into Sage. The Write Standard license would work. Would you be able to use the Write Standard license if the only thing you're doing is clicking that button to send values into Sage, and we don't need to design those entry fields like we described. In the previous demonstrations, we've covered the differences between write and import, and we've gone over some specifics with regards to import. And so thank you for your great insight there, James. Always a pleasure to have you join me on these presentations, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week.